Part two, German unification. Ja, let's go. Das ist gut. I don't know what that was. All right, here we go. So German unification. We really should start the story way back with this super important guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. However, I think you already know what I'm going to say there. So much like Napoleon had created the Napoleonic Code and the Rheinbund, which helped consolidate previously isolated areas into new codified, organized, forward-thinking, economically more solvent and successful places, the Zollverein will do similar things. So the Zollverein is basically a German free trade zone or a commerce union. And so you'll notice like here is Bavaria, Prussia, but all those little states in along there, the Prussian West along over here in the industrial heart on the Rhine. And so all of these territories agreed in the Zollverein to use same currency, same exchange rate, same taxation policies, same weights and scales. So what it does, again, instead of having little independent places all doing their own thing, now we have one Germanic trade zone where all Germans are doing similar things, heavily inspired by Napoleon, Enlightenment wisdom, but it's, again, bringing people into a similar reality, feeling similar sense of unity amongst the people. A growing issue, though, that we noticed in the Rheinbund, certainly in the German Confederation as it grows, is who really is the German godfather, right? Like who's looking out for the people? Is it Prussia of the North? Or is it traditional power Austria, the Holy Roman Empire as it was before Napoleon killed it in the South? Like who really is the glue that holds together the Germans? Okay, so just like we looked at some key players of Italy, here we go, some key players. Kaiser Wilhelm II, he is the Prussian monarch. We have Helmut von Moltke, who is a landed aristocrat and is like one of the prophets of modern warfare. So when we think of like concepts like blitzkrieg, which we'll get to actually a little bit later, but like this idea of using technology and industry, machines as a weapon of war, Helmut von Moltke is really on kind of the front line of that. And then probably the most famous of all these guys is Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He is the Chancellor of Prussia. Some people refer to him as the Iron Chancellor. He gave a very famous speech, if you remember reading the document, in which he said that Germany would be unified through blood and iron. And what really that kind of means is a shout out to the idea of real politics, that war, industrial magnitude, representing themselves in the region would all be essential for German unification. And to be fair, he was right. Germany would be surrounded by a lot of territories that wouldn't be real thrilled to see a growing new German baby state growing in an empire, right? So they were right that they had to right away dive in strong to make this happen. And so some quotes or some ideas of Otto von Bismarck. Very pro-socialist. Oh, it's funny because he's a conservative. We'll talk about this in a little bit. He did foster a sense of social welfare, socialism, which is kind of odd. Sometimes they call this new conservatism, but we'll get more into that in a little bit. So there's the German Confederation at the time of Bismarck. So let's go through the steps. Let's bring them together. Step one was something known as the Danish War. So way up here are territories called Schleswig and Holstein. Long story short, there is a territorial claim as to whether or not Schleswig and Holstein are Germanic or if they are Danish. And so Prussia says that they will come to the aid of these two territories and fight against the Danes. Austria also pledges support, but by the time that they enter into the combat, most of the fighting is already over. The Prussians have kind of done the job. And so even though the Peace of Vienna ends this conflict, it's really the Prussians that have kind of illustrated that they are the protectors, the watchdog of the northern German people. And so it starts to embolden or, I guess, highlight this growing rift between the two. And if you remember the document from the Unification docs, step two is the Austro-Prussian War. And really what's interesting here is Otto von Bismarck already knew, right, that like Prussia would beat Austria and that they would have to like right away turn around and become friends, right? They didn't want this to be bad blood or some sort of like horrible, long persistent feud between these two places. They just needed to illustrate that Austria was not able, to the same level of industrial Prussia, to protect the interests of German states. And so they call it the 7 Weeks War because Prussia absolutely dominates. Remember, Austria, to be fair, is also dealing with issues down in Italy. And remember, Bismarck makes the point that he didn't want one penny, right? He didn't want any bad feeling or ill will between Prussia and Austria, right? This was purely just meant to set up their power. Okay, so step 3, then they create the North and the South German confederations, the Nordbund and the Südbund. The Nordbund would then be officially under Prussian guidance or leadership. So basically what happens then is this German confederation through the Peace of Prague becomes Prussia's like little political puppet. In the South, Austria would have the Südbund. Now, what Bismarck was smart about it, he was a very shrewd politician, is that he understood that they needed something to really unify the people. And so what could unify the people most at this moment in time was intrigue, some sort of foreign distraction. So like I had mentioned before, the Crimean War illustrated this growing idea of realpolitik. Here's a sense of realpolitik. Okay. So in 1868, Spain is being torn apart by revolt. They don't have a leader. They want one of the possible options of a leader would be this German Catholic. So what happens is they forge a document, the Ems Dispatch, in essence, making it look like Spain and France had been talking that this German guy would not be a good fit for this, the Spanish leadership job. And so in essence, what they're doing is they're fabricating fake news to make France look anti-German in order to get German people really pissed off and want to attack. Now, this makes sense, but you have to understand the context. If you remember what we said about Italy, Italy in the north was very industrial and very modern, and the south was not. The same is true for Germany. Right? The two bunts are very different. The north is much more Protestant, much more industrial. It's under the guiding hand of Prussia. The south is much more Catholic, much more rural agricultural. So in order to get this like unified German state to happen, they got to find a way to get everyone involved. And so by making this a shot against Catholics, that's a way of hooking the southern Germans in this and going, wow, that's really bad. And so it works. And they launch the Franco-Prussian War. Right? And so Germany will invade France. As you can see, move right away quickly to Paris. They will surround the city of Paris. And after several weeks of laying siege to the city, the Parisians were starving and desperate. They actually broke into the zoo and ate their own animals and stuff. It was like this very grisly scene of the war. Prussia way overperformed what most people thought they would do. And so this war is like huge for a couple of reasons. One, as you can see, there's a propaganda sense of like, whoa, these Germans are evil and horrible. There's also this like technological aspect. People like Helmut von Moltke had been able to use technology, trains, machine guns to really kind of push war in a certain direction. So von Moltke, for example, understood that like machine guns are still actually a defensive weapon. So even though this is an offensive war, the key would be to take strategic locations, set up defensive positions, and then force the enemy to have to dislodge you from those places. It's kind of an early precursor to blitzkrieg warfare, truthfully. So we get that out of this war. The reason why it's like most significant, though, is France loses and loses horribly. And so Napoleon III will actually surrender to Otto von Bismarck at the Battle of Sedan. The Peace of Frankfurt that comes out after this is the birth of a German empire. So not only does France lose an embarrassing war, but it's the birth of their great rival state in Germany. So it's like salt in that open wound, which is definitely going to hurt extra bad. All right. The last thing that I want to kind of connect to this moment, and we'll finish up Germany here, is this will open up the door to a lot of 20th century problems. So, for example, one part of this Treaty of Frankfurt, you'll notice here, is that France will give away Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. And these are really booming industrial areas, places full of iron deposits, industrial factories for the textile industry. After World War I, these areas will be taken back by the French as punishment to the Germans after that war. And so that bad blood starts here. All right, after World War I, the French leader, Georges Clemenceau, actually referenced the Franco-Prussian War. And he said, I would be damned if I'll fight the Germans for a third war. And what he meant was that the Franco-Prussian War was actually kind of like war number one. World War I was actually kind of war number two, and that they were going to cripple Germany so that there wouldn't be a third war. All right, so much like we saw, similar to what we saw in Italy, right? This idea of kind of legitimacy is at play here. So they crown Kaiser Wilhelm I of Prussia as the King of Germany. All right, so now Germany will be unified under a monarch, right? The Kaiser. So here's all the Prussian junkers, the landed elite, swearing their loyalty or allegiance to him. Sets off a whole bunch of trade wars and conflict. Now, here's where things get kind of odd. Bismarck fears outside influence, right? So even though he had used Catholicism as a bit of a lure for starting the war with the Franco-Prussian War, he fears that the Pope could potentially rip Germany right back apart, right? That the Southern German Catholics would be more sympathetic to this foreign voice of the Pope. And so in order to do that, he begins what's known as the Kulturkampf, the culture struggles, which was an anti-Catholic program. And basically the idea there is it's quite similar to what happened during the French Revolution, truthfully, trying to limit the role of the Catholic Church so that Germany was Germany and not like half Germany and then half dependent on the Catholic Church. So for example, public education, went to the state, not to the church. Marriage had to be recognized or formally conducted by the state. So you could get married in a church, but you had to have a wedding certificate. So those kind of things to try to make sure that the state had the power. Now, other social reforms, and this is wildly critical. Like I would star this somewhere in your notes, right? Contrary to what you'd think, Germany is actually going to be the first place to really issue social welfare programs. And what I mean by that is in order to kind of pacify the growing push of industrial socialists in some of the more urban areas of northern Germany, Bismarck understands that like he's going to have to give away some reform to try to like create loyalty or get people to buy into the state, right? That the state cares for their well-being. And so in order to do that, then he starts to offer things like government insurance, sick pay, government leave, pension and retirement plans, workman's comp, so kind of things that we would consider, I would say basic, but some of our more important benefits that we understand in the modern world actually were first instigated or instituted by Otto von Bismarck. All right, Kaiser Wilhelm II, we will talk more about later. You'll notice that his dates run up through to the end of the Great War, World War I. And so he will abdicate or flee Germany right before the Weimar Republic takes over and we get the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, now the last little bit that I want to go over is just a quick survey of some stuff in Eastern Europe. I know we've talked about Russia here and there. I just want to give you like the quickest of updates. At the same time as all this is going on, during the Crimean War, right? Russia had been going up in the Napoleonic age, and then they kind of faltered with the Decembrists, and then the Crimean War is this great low. Their Tsar Nicholas dies during the Crimean War. Alexander II becomes their new Tsar, and Alexander II is this great reformer. In 1861, he will liberate the serfs, ending serfdom. So now you've got tens of millions of people looking for jobs. And so one of the things that he does to try to help, stymie the amount of unemployment was building railroads. And I don't mean just the transcontinental or the Trans-Siberian Railroad. I mean like many rail projects. But the crowning glory was the 1890s project of the Trans-Siberian Railroad to link the Russian Empire all the way from the Baltic to the Pacific and help their imperial aspirations both in Europe and Asia, right? And so if you think about it, Russia in the late 1890s are pushing into places like Kamchatka, Korea, China. 1905, they're going to have their horribly failed war with Japan, the Russo-Japanese War that really reveals that Russia is a sick and dying empire. Um, and so there's Alexander II, right? This great modernizer. He freed the serfs. He created these Zemstov or Zemstvo, these local, basically they're like county boards, like little miniature state assemblies, I guess, if you look at it. Less censorship, more education, right? He was definitely a man trying to modernize the nation. And so it was shocking. It was disappointing that in 1881, suicide bombers blow him into pieces. And so his son, Alexander III, will be this horribly conservative, reactionary, fearful man that will be quite vindictive against liberals, radicals. He's quite anti-Semitic. And will kind of drive Russia in a much more hardline, authoritarian, repressive nature as we move on here. And so pushing the Jews out of Russia and into the Pale or into Eastern Europe, which is so sad when you think about it, because by the time we get to World War II and Hitler's anti-Semitic views, sadly, the Jews were all really concentrated in one area already, which made it really terrible. The Ottoman Empire is withering throughout the 1860s and 70s, right? They had things called the Tanzimat, which was like this reform movement to try to modernize the Ottoman Empire. Some people loved it. It was kind of enlightened and Western and pro-industrial. More conservative Muslims, traditionalists hated it. And so the empire is really in internal conflict. It's rotting from the inside. Economically, it's stagnant. They have what they called the capitulations. So like British cotton merchants and textile factory owners would come to the Ottoman Empire and loan them large sums of money to build factories, knowing that they would never work or be able to pay off these debts. But then as collateral, then British men would come in and take these factories or these markets, and then they'd have exclusive control over them. So the Ottoman Empire is really kind of in a major cultural and economic strife at the moment. And then lastly, we'll look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, what happens to Austria here. So Austria, much like Russia, right, was an empire based on heterogeneous groupings, right? I mean, you have dozens of different languages and ethnicities all crammed into one empire, which makes it really difficult to rule or to govern over. And so just like today, right, where we're in the news right now, right, we're hearing about, a push by Serbs to take back land from Bosnia, to create a greater Serbia again, right? Like those wounds are there. They're being developed at this time. So really what happens is they come up with something known as the dual monarchy. So in 1867, it was agreed that Austria's empire would split in half. And the Magyars, who are the ethnic majority of Hungary, the Magyars, they would have their own independent Hungarian state. I should say autonomous Hungarian state. In foreign matters, right, Hungary would still be under the Austro Empire, right? So they could not declare war, they couldn't make treaties, they couldn't do anything that would conflict with Austria's international or foreign policies. But on matters that are domestic, right, Hungary then could have local government. Their prince, sorry, the Austrian prince, was the king or the ruler of Hungary. And so you had like kind of like a puppet or a pocket king in Hungary, but at least there was a sense of autonomy in Hungary. Right? And so it gives us this sense again of nationalism, of the dividing or the separating down of these states, and a growing sense of self-determination, which brings us then to the end where it says, Magyars in Hungary were savagely defeated in the revolutions of 1848, which is true. So in the years of most radical revolution, remember in Paris, 1848, in Vienna in 1848, right, like these major protests, all of them being put down quite horribly. By 1867, they get that. Austria, though, will be continue to be a very conservative, a very hard-lined state. Goes back to the Congress of Vienna. But then we get into this like new age of what is known as Christian socialism, right? So people like Karl Lueger will be really instrumental of fostering this new idea of kind of like a betrayed German nationalism or a betrayed Austrian nationalism, right? That instead of fracturing this Eastern Empire apart, remember when Austria used to be the Holy Roman Empire and the glue that held Central Europe together? And it's liberals, it's this new kind of godless, enlightened frontier that's weakening the empire. It's the Jews, it's bourgeois capitalism. These ideas would really find an audience in people like the young Adolf Hitler, who was Austrian, growing up at this time in this region, right? So you get this sense, I don't want to say of betrayal, but of fear of the politics, the betrayal, the global nature of what was becoming, Euro politics and the resentment of that, right? But plenty more for the 20th century to talk about.